Welcome to Constructive Interference. I'm your host, Josh Hugo, going solo this week. This is, of course, leading up to the inevitable death match between myself and Joel, from which only one host will emerge. There can be only one. But this week I want to talk about narratives. Joel, in his solo episode last week, touched on the Jussie Smollett story and how this hoax pulled by Jussie Smollett is being used to enforce certain narratives about our society. And that inspired me to think about ways that the use of narratives can actually run deeper than that, and oftentimes narratives are used to subvert not only the present and current events, but also history. So I'm going to tackle today a couple of common or prevalent historical narratives and show how they really aren't true. One of my all-time favorite stories is BioShock Infinite. Now, BioShock Infinite is, of course, a video game, but I think it stands alone just as a great story, even if you don't appreciate video games. And one of the aspects of BioShock Infinite that I love is the way it shows how propaganda can subvert history. Now, in that story, there is this entire, I guess we'll call it an alternative America, an alternative civilization, constructed by this guy who calls himself Prophet Comstock. And he has taken the story of George Washington, of Lincoln, of the founding of America, of the Civil War, the whole idea of American history, American greatness, and twisted it and subverted it to create his own twisted version of American society, which he runs sort of as this dictatorial cult leader. But that sort of thing actually is done a lot in real life. Not to that extreme, of course. BioShock Infinite is sort of an extreme, almost a parody version of this actual phenomenon. But this is actually done all the time in real life, where some leader or some group will take real historical events and sort of reframe them, twist them, subvert them to suit whatever narrative they want to create. So I'm going to go through just a couple of examples here of ways that is done. Now, I want to say off the bat right now that this is not meant to be exhaustive. This is not like a scholarly paper where I'm going to explain all of these things in detail. I'm just going to go through a couple of these historical narratives that I've encountered, and I'm going to tell the place where I've encountered them most vividly. And then I'm going to give some examples that show how those historical narratives aren't actually correct. I'm going to go through them real quick, like I said. So neither the explanations of the narratives nor the refutations is going to be comprehensive. These are just my sort of personal, quick examples of how I've encountered these things and the facts that I have found that begin to show how they're untrue. So the first of these that I want to talk about is a narrative that you see a lot in sort of progressive or feminist circles, and this is the narrative of Western society versus women. I found this narrative presented most strongly in the novel The Da Vinci Code. Now, most people remember The Da Vinci Code, as sort of a hokey thriller. But when I read The Da Vinci Code, what really stuck out to me is this historical narrative it portrayed. Now, spoilers if you haven't read The Da Vinci Code. Actually, I don't recommend you read The Da Vinci Code, but spoilers here in case you were going to read it or see the movie. The basic thrust of the book is that Jesus Christ was a mortal man, not the Son of God, not divine. Jesus Christ was a mortal man, and he got married and had children. And according to the narrative in the Da Vinci Code, the Catholic Church wanted to suppress this fact basically because the Catholic Church was anti-woman. And the Catholic Church didn't want it to be known that Jesus had married a woman, had sex with a woman, and fathered children because they saw that as basically empowering females. And the book was set up to contrast what author Dan Brown saw as the feminist paganism of the past. And he sort of set this up as a contest between the misogynistic Catholic Church and the feminist paganism. The Catholic Church wanting to suppress women, suppress feminism, so that the patriarchy could rule. And that sort of narrative is something that we actually see a lot. The women's liberation movement is not named that by accident. There are lots of people who really think that women historically, as a class, that women are oppressed by Western society, that women in the past or women in some sort of a natural state were more powerful and were socially equal to men, and that the West, especially the church Christianity, is keeping the women down. This narrative, if you think about it, is actually pretty silly. Because if you know anything about history, if you look back at Roman history and see that women essentially had no rights in ancient Rome, were considered basically the property of their husbands. Go back further than that, look at Greek society, you see kind of the same thing. If you go over to the East and look at the ancient Japanese or Chinese societies, you see a very, very similar phenomenon where women have few rights or no rights. You look to ancient Egypt, you see the same thing. You see strong patriarchal structures in which women are sort of subordinate or subservient. And also, if you look at the pagan cultures, the Druids and so forth that Dan Brown was looking at for inspiration when he wrote the Da Vinci Code, he considered them to be feminist because they had female shamans and female deities. But if you actually look at and study those histories, those female shamans and deities were not there as sort of rulers. You know, they weren't like these Zeus-like gods who presided over other things and commanded their will. They were more like fertility deities. You know, you have the female shaman will perform perhaps some sort of sexual ritual. And sexual rituals, of course, were very common throughout many societies. You know, the idea of a temple or a shrine prostitute pops up in lots of places. You know, you see that in Hinduism, of course, in the Canaanite religions in the ancient Middle East, and also in the Druidic religions in the ancient Europe. So these female religious figures are not appearing in these contexts as rulers. So they're appearing as fertility symbols, which are probably in some ways subservient to the male gods. And I'm not trying to say here that that's good or bad. You know, I'm not trying to pass judgment on either our current society or on ancient societies. I'm simply trying to point out here that this myth that Dan Brown puts forth in the Da Vinci Code, you know, that women in the past used to be empowered, used to be powerful, then the Catholic Church came along and squashed them, simply has no basis in history. Of course, it's different places in geography and time. You know, women have fared better or worse. But generally speaking, women being in a social sense subservient to men, men being heads of households, that has been the norm across cultures and throughout history. And so this idea that we need to somehow get back to some ancient Druidic feminism that Christianity has stamped out is just nonsense. That feminist interpretation of history is, of course, a narrative that is popular on the left. So I want to pivot now to a narrative that is popular on the right, and that is the narrative of the West versus Islam. Now, I hadn't encountered this idea, of course, until after 9/11. Of course, I'm only 35, so 9/11 was not far into my adult years. But up until that point, you know, listening to conservative radios and to Rush Limbaugh or whatever, you know, you didn't hear about Islam very much. And if you did, it was this idea that Islam was sort of maybe a primitive religion, you know, that people had far away, and it didn't really concern or affect us. But after 9/11, this narrative emerged of the 1400-year war, and this narrative basically says that Muhammad, when he began Islam back in the 600s AD, from the very moment that he started it, it was at war with the West. We've been in a continual state of war and conflict ever since then, and there's been basically no peace for the 1400 years, and one of us has to win. You know, there can be only one, Christianity and Islam. One of those two has to be extinguished ultimately. Otherwise, it's going to be continuous war and strife. And I've seen this idea promoted in many places. One person who is a big proponent of it is this guy, Robert Spencer, who's written a book called 1400 Years of Jihad. And I'll link to an article about him in the American Thinker magazine, you know, to illustrate this idea. So this myth, I'll just straight up say it's a myth. While it is, of course, very true that there has been conflict between Christians and Muslims ever since Islam began, this idea of a war between two factions simply is not accurate, and neither is the idea of Islam being this sort of malignant Borg-like force that swept across the earth accurate. It seems that way from our perspective sometimes because we don't understand the contrasts involved. While it is true that Islam spread rapidly, and Islam spread by the sword, and Islam was often spread with cruelty, you know, with the beheadings and the killing of infidels and all these things, you know, all that is largely true. You know, those things did, of course, happen. And I don't mean to give some sort of blanket defense of Islam here and say Islam isn't bad. But when Islam was spread by the sword, it was being spread to disunified tribes. Prior to Muhammad, the tribes of Arabia and the Middle East and Northern Africa, they were largely disunified. They were just tribal societies where groups of a couple thousand perhaps people would live and sort of keep to themselves and be antagonistic to their neighbors. So what Muhammad did is to take all of these disparate tribes in this area and unify them. And that, incidentally, is why he was able to have such military success as he did so quickly, is because the people he was fighting were disunified. And, if there's if you have 1 million people you want to conquer, but they're all divided up into groups of, 5,000, if they were united as 1 million people, you could never conquer them. But if they're disunified as 5,000, take them out one at a time, and each one you conquer actually makes you stronger and more powerful. So Muhammad, not trying to defend him and say he was a great guy by any means, but if you understand that what he was doing with his conquests was unifying a lot of disparate tribes. And if you understand it in that context, what he did is really not much different from what any number of other conquerors have done. What did Alexander the Great do when he came through and, conquered the Mediterranean area? What did the first Chinese emperors do when they unified China? If you're trying to unify a large area under one government, then, violent, I guess I'll just say violent oppressive tactics are just sort of what you do. And I'm not trying to justify those tactics, but simply point out that Muhammad's tactics of spreading his religion by the sword and, killing people who wouldn't submit to him was hardly unique. That's the pattern followed by many conquerors who followed the same mold. Also his pattern, again, Muhammad is demonized, for taking many wives, for allowing and endorsing brutality against his enemies, which of course is bad. But again, it's not really much different from what other conquerors did in the past or even in the present when they would go through and unify an area. You consider Muhammad to be one of these sort of bad guy conquerors, fine, maybe think of him almost like as a sort of a Genghis Khan figure. Well, okay, maybe that's fine too. Maybe that's accurate. But to think of Islam as being some sort of a unique malignance, that what happened under Muhammad was, somehow worse than what had come before or since, really isn't accurate. That's just sort of humans being humans. And as far as the atrocities of Islam after that, I've read accounts in various places blaming Muslims for just slaughtering enormous, ridiculous amounts of people. I think I read somewhere that some report, it was one of these right-wing sort of conspiracy sites, but claiming that Muslims slaughtered 500 million people in India, which, if you understand the global populations throughout history, doesn't really actually make sense. It'd be pretty logistically difficult to actually kill 500 million people at any point in history because there just aren't that many people around. But the fact is that when Islam will come into an area, of course, Islam is intolerant. If you are a Christian or a Jew, you might be tolerated, but you'll be forced to live as a second-class citizen, which, again, is not that different from what other civilizations typically have done. One thing, though, one particular fact that I want to point out as far as sort of refuting this myth of the perpetual antagonism and violence between Christianity and Islam is the fact of the Moorish occupation of Spain. It seems to me that very few people are aware of this. I think that in the popular imagination, we think of the Muslims occupying the Middle East, perhaps Northern Africa, and Christians occupying, Europe. And we think of conflict between the two groups as occurring during the Crusades, which, some right-wing sources will cast as being, defensive wars, repelling Muslim invasions. But we think of those conflicts as occurring in the Middle East during the Crusades, and otherwise the two areas being more or less separated. But what many people don't seem to know is that Muslim rulers actually controlled large areas of Spain for close to 800 years, starting in the year 711 when the first Moorish invaders came from North Africa, and not ending until 1492, yes, the same year Columbus sailed the ocean blue. 1492 was the year that the Spanish Catholics actually defeated and pushed out the last of the Muslim rulers in Spain. So there's an 800-year period of continuous Muslim rule in Spain, in various parts of it. Of course, that border was always fluctuating because the Christians, the Muslims, they didn't they didn't like each other, and the Pope and the Christian powers didn't like having Muslims, in Europe. So there was, animosity and conflict there. I'm not saying it was all, peaceful and they lived happily together, but nonetheless, they existed. There was a Muslim presence in Spain, ruling, controlling, having power for almost 800 years, and it was not a period of darkness and oppression and slaughter. For the Spanish Christians there. There was, to a large degree, a peaceful coexistence. And I'm not going to try and, detail the history here. I'm trying to keep this brief, but do read up on it. Read up on Moorish Spain, and you'll see that it simply isn't true. This idea that Islam is utterly incompatible and indelibly antagonistic toward everything else, that Muslims can't live peacefully with anybody else or with each other. And again, this is not intended to be a defense of Islam, saying Islam is good. I'm simply pointing out that Islam isn't the great evil. It isn't the ultimate bad thing that it's made out to be. Muslims pretty much are like other people. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. But overall, as the Moors living in Spain for 800 years proves, peaceful coexistence is indeed possible. And casting the conflict between Islam and Christianity as a 1400-year war that somebody has to win doesn't make sense historically. We started with a left-wing historical narrative, move on to a right-wing one. Now let's pivot back to another left-wing historical narrative, and that is the narrative of class warfare. Karl Marx published his most famous work, the Communist Manifesto, 171 years ago. So Marxism is not a new or cutting-edge idea. Marxism, by this point in history, in the year 2019, is a very old and well-established idea that has picked up a lot of traditions at this point. But Karl Marx, who published the Manifesto 171 years ago, he saw history through a lens of class warfare. His interpretation of history was that there was the bourgeois, or the ruling class, who owned the land, who owned the factories, who owned the means of production, and they used their ownership of those things to lord it over who he called the proletariat, who were, the workers. And basically because the proletariat had no property, they didn't own the means of production, didn't own land, didn't own the factories, they therefore had no control over their own lives, and they were oppressed by the bourgeois who did have all the property and therefore had the power. Karl Marx, he foresaw a future in which this system would collapse, that the proletariat would rise up against their oppressors, seize the means of production, and we would have this sort of flat egalitarian society with no rulers and no property. Of course, nowadays, this paradigm where we have the bourgeois and the proletariat doesn't really make sense anymore because pretty much everybody in modern society, in American society, is what Marx would have thought of as bourgeois. Most people own property of some kind. Many people own houses. Many people own stock in companies and thereby own means of production. There are many people who are self-employed. Karl Marx, not really much of a future predictor, not much of a prophet, did not foresee this world we live in now, in which pretty much, I won't say everyone, but a large portion of people are what he would think of as bourgeois, and the number of people he would think of as proletariat have shrunk immensely. And yet this idea of Marxism is still alive, this idea of seeing the world in terms of class and class struggle and picturing the lower oppressed classes one day rising up to overthrow their oppressors. The thing is nowadays, because the old class structure doesn't work anymore, so now we have a new class structure. It's called intersectionality. Intersectionality, if you haven't heard the term before, is basically you look at every aspect of a person except their actions. You look at a person's race, their gender, their historical background, what income level they were born with, all these things, and you divide them all into classes according to those, and you look for the intersections and say, well, people who have qualities A, B, C, and X, those people seem to be doing better than people who have qualities D, G, and Y, and therefore we'll divide them into classes and say the people who have this better intersection with their class descriptors are the oppressors, and the people who have this worse class profile are the new victims. And one of the ways we see that, again, I'm just pulling this example out, not because it's necessarily the best, but because it's one that I know is popular and that I've seen around a lot, and that is the wage gap. We've all heard this idea that women make 70 cents of what a man makes. A man makes $1, a woman makes 70 cents. And that myth has been extremely widely believed and widely circulated. I even recall seeing it on Obama's website, whitehouse.gov, back when Obama was president, this myth being intentionally promoted, even from the White House. The class struggle narrative isn't true just in general. If you look at the progress of the last 171 years since Marx published his manifesto, two things have not happened. One, the proletariat has never risen up against the bourgeois, and the reason they haven't done that is because of two. The proletariat, so-called, has gotten very rich, comparatively speaking, over that time period. If you look at factors like, the amount of income people are making, the amount of resources people have, things they own, and the amount of time people are living, the average person today is so much better off than the average person 171 years ago that there are, billions more of us. Basically, we've gotten so wealthy compared to our ancestors, that it's allowed our population to just explode and for all of us to live, averaging into our 70s instead of, averaging into our 40s. So Marx's prediction of the proletariat rising up, in large part, has not happened just because it wasn't necessary. The oppressive, impoverished conditions that he thought the proletariat would endure that would inspire them to rise up simply faded away. And they faded away not because of communism, not because of communist revolutions, but because of capitalism and free markets, the very things that communists rode rail against. But more specifically, this modern idea of intersectionality, which is, of course, supported by this wage gap idea, really doesn't fly if you think about it. I'll post a link to an article explaining this better, but this idea that women make less money than men, it doesn't account for behavioral differences. It doesn't account for the way women act differently from men. And the fact is, women, I won't go into why, but for various reasons, women tend to not invest as much energy into their careers. Women take more time off, both in terms of, vacation time, of maternity leave, of unpaid leaves of absences, for various reasons. Women tend to take a lot more time off. They work less overtime. They generally don't invest as much energy into their careers. And of course, it's not a criticism of women, because this idea that your career should be everything is a fallacy, in my opinion. To say that women are not investing as much in their careers, not to criticize women, because I think there are plenty of better, more productive things you could possibly put your energy into than a career. But the fact is that this apparent discrepancy in the amount of money that men and women make is not due to class oppression. It's not due to the bourgeois males oppressing the proletariat females, as the Marxist view of history would interpret it. Rather, it's simply a matter of people behaving differently, having different priorities. So while the Marxists will view history as this great class struggle between the oppressed and the oppressors, if you look at the historical facts or the contemporary facts, that narrative just doesn't add up. Let's talk now about another right-wing historical narrative. This is one that is so pervasive and so entrenched that you could write, a series of books addressing this. But this is the myth of heroic America. And what I mean by that is this narrative, popular in the right, that basically America has been this ultimate good guy on the world stage. That ever since 1776, as soon as the signatures went down on the Declaration of Independence, at that moment, America became the global hero, and everything that we've done everywhere since then has been only good, and the world owes us a huge debt of gratitude, for all the good stuff we've done. That idea is so prevalent in so many places that naming a specific one seems silly. But I remember encountering it very vividly when I listened to Adventures in Odyssey as a child. Now, I don't mean to diss on Adventures in Odyssey. I loved it, and I still do. It was a great show produced by Focus on the Family that I think is still in production, actually. But Focus on the Family's Adventures in Odyssey, they would have episodes that were historical episodes, which would feature historical figures, like Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or Christopher Columbus. And I remember very distinctly how rosy, how whitewashed the historical views presented in these audio dramas were. Listening to the episode about Columbus makes out Columbus just to be a complete hero. It makes him out to be this complete white hat figure who's a visionary, who is a great Christian, who is going out to evangelize the world, and other figures also. Without going into more detail, just basically this idea that in Adventures in Odyssey, even in their portrayal of things like the Vietnam War, America just complete hero, complete good guy, no blemishes, no stains. And again, people will accuse me of sounding like a liberal when I say this, saying, oh, you're just pushing the left's narrative. Well, no, I'm not. I'm just trying to give perspective. Now, while there's no denying that America has done a lot of good things, and I wouldn't say that I'm proud to be an American, but I would say that I'm glad to be an American. I'm very happy to have been born American. I definitely recognize the immense benefits that's given to me. So not mean to dump on America, but rather to offer perspective. So America has certainly done a lot of good things, but it's done bad things too. I know that most conservatives would say that they are pro-life, anti-abortion. Well, America has been responsible for somewhere in the realm of 60 million abortions over the last 40 plus years. So obviously, if we regard abortion as being murder and say that under America's laws, under America's watch, that many abortions have occurred, that many people have been killed, that should obviously put a big dent in America's, white hat reputation. But as far as foreign policy, as far as foreign affairs, this idea that America is always good isn't really accurate either. There are many things to point to illustrate that, but one thing that really strikes me is the American-Philippine War. And that is a war that you don't hear much about. And I think the reason you don't hear much about it is because, well, America was the bad guy in that conflict. The American-Philippine War was from 1899 to 1902. Now, the Philippines, in case you don't know, is an island way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that logically has nothing to do with the United States, especially at that time. This is actually back before World War I. This is back before Imperial Japan was a thing, back before the Soviet Union was a thing. So why was the United States at war in the Philippines in 1899? Obviously, the Filipinos weren't invading us. Well, the reason is simply because we had just won the Spanish-American War. We had won that in 1898, and the Philippines were a Spanish colony. And part of the treaty signed in Paris that ended the Spanish-American War, one of the terms of that treaty is that the United States would get various Spanish possessions, one of which was the Philippines. So the reason we had the Philippines was simply because the Spanish had it and they gave it to us, and that's why we had it, and that's the only interest that we had there. We hadn't gone and conquered it. If you want to think that conquest is a fair and square way to get territory, we hadn't actually conquered the Philippines from the Filipinos. They hadn't attacked us. We had really no reason to be there except that the land got handed to us, and so it was ours. So the Filipinos simply wanted independence. They didn't like being ruled by Spain. There had already been various insurrections against the Spanish prior to America acquiring the Philippines. And when America got it, they didn't want to be ruled by us either. The Filipinos wanted independence. And their fight against the Americans was very simply, very straightforward, a struggle for independence. They wanted no foreign rule. They wanted to rule themselves. Now, there are various estimates. No one's really sure, but it's estimated that between 200,000 and 1 million Filipino civilians died in the Philippine-American War. Most of them died, from disease and starvation because the Americans pretty much destroyed the Filipino infrastructure. We wanted to defeat their armies and root them out. And so we would, destroy their food supplies, destroy their roads, and so forth, which of course hurts the civilians too. So the American forces between 1899 and 1902 were responsible for somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million civilian deaths in the Philippines. And why were we fighting there? What was our noble cause? Our noble cause, quote unquote, was simply to hang on to the land because we got it from the Spanish, and that was it. That's all there was to it. The land was pretty much worthless to us. As a matter of fact, we ended up just giving it up in a couple decades anyway. The Philippines today are independent. They're not an American colony. They're not an American possession. And that's just because we really didn't even want it. We were just fighting for it because, well, dang, it's ours, so we're gonna hold on to it, whether the natives there like it or not. So I bring this up just simply to point out one example of a way that America was the bad guy. And, the Philippine War is not unique. It's not the only time when Americans were the bad guy in a foreign war. But to me, it's a very striking one because when you think about our motives for fighting, their motives for fighting, and the number of people who died, if any other power other than the United States had done that, we would consider it a black mark on their history forever. But because the United States did it, we forget about it. And we whitewash that history along with a lot of our other history. And again, my goal here, I'm not trying to dump on the United States and say that America is bad, just trying to give that perspective. I don't want to dispute that America is a net force for good in world history. But as far as America always being the good guys, always being the white hats, always being on the noble side, America has been the bad guy at various times, and probably a lot more times than people would want to admit or realize. But of course, while the right has the myth of the heroic America and uses that as their view of history, the left has their own counter-myth, which is the view of the villainous white colonialists who have conquered the world and oppressed it. My favorite expression, or I guess I'll say the one that struck me the most at the time, expression of this philosophy is actually from the Disney movie Pocahontas. There's a scene in Pocahontas where the Native Americans are having, sort of a ritual where their shaman is trying to spiritually divine some information about these white people who have come and showed up on their land. And the quote from that scene is, speaking of the white people, "They prowl the earth like ravenous wolves, consuming everything in their path." The white people, they prowl the earth like ravenous wolves, consuming everything in their path. And to me, I think that really sums up the leftist Europeans as villains narrative pretty well. There's this idea that all the people who weren't from Europe, be they from Native Americans, Indian, African, wherever in the world these people might be, that everything was hunky-dory, everybody was nice and happy and egalitarian and in harmony with nature and green and all that good stuff. And then the evil white men came with their guns and killed everybody and enslaved everybody and destroyed everything, and that's why the world sucks. And again, that's a narrative that is so entrenched and so popular that it'd be hard to even pin it down to one source. But if you look historically, that isn't true either. I said of Islam earlier that many of the atrocities ascribed to Islam are simply how people generally treat each other. Well, the same thing holds true of the white Europeans. The Europeans did a lot of bad stuff. Columbus, especially, the stories about him just being a real jerk to the native populations he encountered, where he would, actually torture them to extract gold. We know the Spanish in general, when they came to America, they had a real rape and pillage mentality, where they came here, they wanted the gold, and the Native Americans were just sort of in their way in their quest for gold. So yeah, I'm not trying to say that Europeans in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries in that era didn't do bad stuff. I'm not trying to say that they didn't commit atrocities, that they didn't abuse populations, but none of that stuff is really unique. If you look at the way Native Americans, for instance, treated each other, of course, the Aztecs are famous for their human sacrifices. The Aztecs would conquer other groups of Native Americans and haul those victims up on top of their sacrificial pyramids and rip their hearts out and cut off their heads. The Mel Gibson movie Apocalypto shows this in really disgusting, gory detail. And that sort of thing, again, wasn't uncommon. We talk about slavery in the United States. And again, I'm not by any means trying to excuse slavery or say that wasn't a horrible, evil thing. But you gotta understand that the slave traders didn't go into Africa with armies to capture Africans to be slaves. The Africans were sold to them by other Africans. Africans would go and capture rival African tribes or rival African groups and sell their captives to the white slave traders. And you can look all over the world and find some situations where these native people who were being conquered by the Europeans or subjugated to the Europeans, they weren't necessarily nice people. They were bad to their neighbors. They were bad to each other. And in a lot of situations, the way they treated each other was actually worse than the way the Europeans treated them. As bad and as brutal as the Spanish were when they came through looking for gold, you didn't have the Spanish hauling Native Americans to the top of pyramids to cut their hearts out to appease the Christian God. But you did have that sort of thing happening not only with the Aztecs, but with other Native American cultures as well, even up into North America. So while the Europeans, of course, did bad things, they weren't uniquely bad. They were uniquely powerful. The Europeans, of course, they had good sailing ships, they had guns, they had good metalworks for armor, all of these things. And so the Europeans were uniquely powerful, which allowed them to conquer other populations. But why were they uniquely powerful? Why did the Europeans develop these advanced civilizations with their advanced technologies that allowed them to dominate and not other cultures? Well, to a large extent, it's actually because the Europeans were more compassionate and peaceful than other cultures. This idea of human rights developed under the influence of Christianity in Europe. The ideals of chivalry, of respecting people weaker than yourself, ideals derived from Christianity are the main reason why Europe advanced and why Europe became this power, and other places like, for instance, India or places in Africa really didn't. So it's not that the Europeans were especially evil, it's that the Europeans were especially powerful. And they were especially powerful, actually, to an extent, because they were actually nicer and kinder and more compassionate than the cultures that they were overrunning. And if you look at the world today, and look at the places today in the modern world where human rights are prevalent, where women are treated with respect, where there is a strong sense of justice, it really tends to be the places where Europeans have had influence. If you look at a place like Saudi Arabia, for instance, I saw headlines just recently that they're now starting to allow women to drive cars because Saudi Arabia, although being very modern, very rich, has no Christian influences. It's a completely Muslim country, and Islam traditionally does not have a high view of women, does not give women a lot of rights. If you look at places like for instance, Pakistan, again, not a good place to be a woman or a child. Human rights are not well protected. There's not a good sense of justice there. Some of the greatest human rights violations that have happened in recent history in the 20th century happened in Asian countries like in China or Cambodia after the communists, who are, of course, nominally atheist, took over and enacted policies that either indirectly or directly killed millions of people. So if you look at history, the European colonization has actually been a net positive for most of the places where it occurred. And it was a net positive because it brought this sort of compassionate Christian culture with it, and because it brought technological advances. And because it opened up those places to trade with other parts of the world, kind of broadened their horizons. So, once again, there's a fifth myth busted. This historical narrative that everything was great in the world until the white people came along and ruined it. It doesn't add up. So what is the correct historical narrative? What is the right way to view history? Well, there's not one. There's not one because history is complex, because people are complex. In every place in history at every time, you have different people with different motivations and different influences on individuals and influences on the society as a whole. History is very complex, and trying to understand all of anything through any one narrative lens is going to be reductionist and going to be a failure. There is no single overarching narrative that's going to explain all of history, or even significant parts of history. If you have a narrative that explains what happened in America in 1500 and also explains what happened in Russia in 1900 and also explains what happened in Greece 2,000 years ago, your narrative is wrong, because there is no narrative that can cover all of these things. And you have to understand each of these scenarios, each of these people groups in their own context. And that's why we have a study of history. That's why there are history books. That's why you can get a degree in history. Because if history were actually so simple that you could understand all of it with a Marxist or a feminist or an Americanist narrative, then history wouldn't be a thing. You would just simply know the narrative and explain it all. And I think that that actually is a reason for a lot of the uncivility and confusion in our current public discourse in America, is because people do try to do that. They do try to pick their favorite narrative that they think explains the current situation and project that back into history and try and pick out the same heroes and villains that they imagine today existing in the past. And that just doesn't work. So don't do it. I'm Josh Hugo, and you've been listening to Constructive Interference. Hopefully Joel will be back with me next week. See you then.